December 2, 1993. The radio static cut through the humid air of a quiet, middle-class barrio in Medellin. But the true story didn't begin on that blood-stained rooftop. It began months earlier, with a different kind of horror. For years, one man had held an entire nation hostage, ruling with a mix of bombs and bribes that made him untouchable. But suddenly, the dynamic shifted. The bodies of his most loyal hitmen started appearing on street corners at dawn, not arrested, but executed. Beside them lay crude cardboard signs bearing two words that struck terror even into the heart of the devil himself, Los Pepes. This was no longer just a police operation. It was a savage, unauthorized vendetta that turned the world's most dangerous hunter into desperate prey. As the Medellin Cartel war reached its bloody, chaotic climax, a chilling question emerged from the smoke: to destroy a monster, did we have to create something even worse? This is the untold, brutal truth behind the Pablo Escobar death, a story where the line between justice and vengeance disappears completely. To understand the brutality of the end, we must look at the arrogance of the beginning. By the early 1990s, Pablo Escobar was not merely a criminal, he was a myth. He had forced the Colombian government to rewrite its constitution to ban extradition, and in return, he agreed to surrender. But his prison, La Catedral, was a prison in name only. Nestled high in the foggy mountains overlooking Medellin, it was a fortress of luxury, complete with a soccer field, a bar, and a jacuzzi. From this sanctuary, the Medellin Cartel war was still being directed, but the walls of the prison were closing in on Pablo's mind. Isolation breeds paranoia, even for a king. Inside La Catedral, surrounded by sycophants and hitmen, Pablo began to suspect that his lieutenants on the outside were skimming from the empire he had built. This paranoia would spark the defining moment of the Narcos' real story, a mistake that would cost him everything. Two of his most loyal partners, Fernando Galeano and Moncada, were summoned to their prison to answer for missing funds. These were men who had stood by him when the bombs were falling, men who kept the cash flowing while Pablo sat in his golden cage. The meeting was not a negotiation, it was a slaughter. Inside the cold walls of La Catedral, Pablo accused them of betrayal. Despite their pleas of innocence and years of service, they were brutally tortured and dismembered while Pablo waited in the next room. He believed this act of terror would solidify his control, proving that no one was untouchable. He was wrong. In the criminal underworld, there is a code: you kill your enemies, but you do not butcher your partners without cause. When the bodies were incinerated, the loyalty of the cartel went up in smoke with them. News of the betrayal spread through the underworld like wildfire. The Galeano and Moncada families were not just grieving, they were terrified, knowing they would be next. But fear often turns into rage. They realized that as long as Pablo was alive, no one was safe, not his enemies, and certainly not his friends. This realization created a power vacuum that the Cali Cartel, Pablo's bitter rivals from the south, was eager to fill. But they needed foot soldiers who knew the streets of Medellin. It was a perfect storm of hatred. The surviving members of the Moncada and Galeano clans reached out to the Castaño brothers, Fidel and Carlos. The Castaños were fierce paramilitaries with a personal vendetta against Escobar, fueled by deep political and personal grievances. Bankrolled by the deep pockets of the Cali Cartel and driven by the blood debt of the betrayed families, a new shadow organization was formed. They called themselves Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, or simply, Los Pepes. This was the true beginning of the end. Los Pepes' history was written in the blood of that betrayal at La Catedral. Unlike the police, who were bound by laws and bureaucracy, Los Pepes had no rules. They had intimate knowledge of Pablo's operation because many of them had helped build it. They knew where the safe houses were. They knew who laundered the money. And most importantly, they knew that Pablo's power relied on the fear he instilled in others. They decided to turn that weapon around. When Pablo escaped La Catedral in July 1992, fleeing into the jungle to avoid a transfer to a real prison, he thought he was returning to a city he owned. He expected the people of Medellin to hide him and his army to protect him. Instead, he walked into a trap of his own making. The Medellin Cartel war had shifted. He was no longer fighting a government trying to arrest him, he was facing a hydra of enemies who wanted him dead. The hunter had become the hunted, and the streets he once ruled were about to become his graveyard. By early 1993, the rules of engagement had vanished. The Medellin Cartel war had transformed into a carnage that shocked even a nation accustomed to violence. For decades, Pablo Escobar had operated under the assumption that his family and his inner circle were off-limits. He believed his violence was a one-way street. But Los Pepes' history is defined by the moment that street became a dead end. The new enemy didn't want to negotiate, they wanted to dismantle Pablo, piece by bloody piece. The retaliation was swift and surgical. In a coordinated blitzkrieg, Los Pepes struck at the very pillars of Escobar's empire. They didn't just target the gunman, they targeted the infrastructure of his life. One by one, the luxurious haciendas that symbolized Pablo's immense wealth were torched to the ground. His prized collection of classic cars, a symbol of his status and ego, was reduced to twisted scrap metal in a single night of arson. It was a message loud and clear: everything you built, we will burn. But the destruction of property was just the prelude. The body count began to rise with terrifying speed. Los Pepes, funded heavily by the rival Cali Cartel, marking the peak of the Cali Cartel versus Pablo conflict, placed multi-million-dollar bounties on the heads of Escobar's associates. Suddenly, loyalty became a liability. Hitmen who had served Pablo for years were found dead with signs hanging from their necks. Lawyers who defended him were gunned down in broad daylight. Even the maids and gardeners working for his family were not safe. The message to the city was brutal: if you breathe the same air as Pablo Escobar, you are a target. This was the specific brand of psychological warfare that defined the Los Pepes' history. They were using Pablo's own tactics, car bombs, kidnapping, and torture, but they were doing it with the efficiency of a death squad and the funding of a multinational corporation. The fear in Medellin shifted. People were no longer just afraid of the doctor, they were terrified of the invisible army hunting him. The police, officially known as the Search Bloc, were operating in the daylight, but at night, the shadows belonged to Los Pepes. For Pablo, this was a nightmare scenario. The man who had once bombed a commercial airliner to kill one person was now watching his own world implode. The psychological toll was immense. He was forced to move constantly, sleeping in different safe houses every night, often in the slums he once claimed to uplift. The Robin Hood of Medellin was now a fugitive in his own kingdom. His empire, once run with the precision of a Fortune 500 company, was fracturing. He couldn't communicate with his lieutenants without fearing a wiretap or a traitor. The Medellin Cartel war was no longer about expansion, it was solely about survival. The violence reached a fever pitch that paralyzed the city. Car bombs detonated in shopping centers and busy streets as Pablo lashed out in desperation, trying to force the government to concede. But every bomb he planted only strengthened the resolve of his enemies. The Cali Cartel versus Pablo dynamic had created a scenario where his rivals were viewed as the lesser of two evils by the authorities, allowing Los Pepes to operate with terrifying impunity. As the net tightened, the question on everyone's lips wasn't if Pablo would fall, but who killed Pablo Escobar would eventually become the headline. Would it be the Search Bloc? The Americans? Or would it be the shadowy executioners of Los Pepes? The invincibility of the drug lord had been shattered. He was bleeding cash, bleeding territory, and bleeding allies. The peak of the war was here, and for the first time in his life, Pablo Escobar was losing. By late 1993, the world of the most powerful criminal in history had shrunk from a sprawling empire to a single, nondescript room in a middle-class barrio. The Medellin Cartel war was effectively over, and Pablo had lost. His armies were dead or imprisoned. His wealth was buried or seized. But the cruelest blow wasn't financial, it was personal. The man who had burned millions of dollars just to keep his daughter warm was now completely cut off from the only thing he truly loved, his family. The turning point came in November 1993. In a desperate bid to save his wife and children from the wrath of Los Pepes, Pablo arranged for them to flee to Germany. But the world had closed its doors. The German government sent them back immediately, trapping them in the Tequendama Hotel in Bogotá under heavy government surveillance. For Pablo, watching the news from his hideout in the Los Olivos neighborhood, this was the final straw. He was isolated, powerless, and for the first time, truly afraid, not for himself, but for them. This isolation was the weapon that would finally pierce his armor. The Cali Cartel versus Pablo conflict had stripped away his layers of protection, leaving him exposed. He was hiding in plain sight, living like a ghost in a city he used to own. He celebrated his 44th birthday alone, eating cake with a bodyguard, a pathetic shadow of the lavish parties of the past. Their patron was gone. In his place was a tired, overweight man in flip-flops, suffering from a stomachache and the crushing weight of silence. It was this silence that broke him. He knew the Search Bloc and American intelligence were scanning the airwaves, waiting for a signal. He knew that using the phone was a death sentence. But the desperation of a father outweighed the caution of a fugitive. On December 2nd, the day after his birthday, he couldn't resist. He picked up the radio telephone to call his son, Juan Pablo. He didn't make a quick command, he had a conversation. He asked about the hotel, the press, the safety of his little girl. For over 20 minutes, he stayed on the line, a lifetime in the world of electronic surveillance. It was a fatal mistake, a lapse in judgment born from pure emotional exhaustion. As he spoke words of comfort to his son, a team of electronic warfare specialists in a van miles away saw a spike on their screen. They had him. That phone call was the beginning of the Pablo Escobar death sequence. It wasn't a betrayal by a lieutenant or a brilliant detective's deduction that found him, it was his own humanity. The love for his family, the same motivation that he claimed justified his crimes, became the very thing that led the hunters to his door. The triangulation was complete. The screen flashed the location, Los Olivos. The engines of the Search Bloc roared to life. The wolf was cornered, and the hunt was about to end, while the cameras focused on the brave Colombian police officers of the Search Bloc. A much darker reality was unfolding behind the scenes. From the perspective of Washington, the Medellin Cartel war had become more than a law enforcement issue, it was a threat to national security. But to catch a ghost like Pablo, standard procedures weren't enough. This desperation birthed one of the most controversial chapters in the history of American foreign policy in Latin America, a chapter often omitted from the official victory speeches. In the sterilized hallways of Langley and the DEA headquarters, a brutal calculus was being made. The official narrative was clear: the good guys, the state, versus the bad guy, Escobar. But the Narcos' real story is rarely that black and white. Reports and declassified documents that surfaced years later painted a disturbing picture. To pinpoint Pablo's location, advanced surveillance technology was required, technology that only the Americans possessed. But to root him out of the slums, you needed brute force and local knowledge, something only Los Pepes possessed. This created a shadow alliance. While officially denied, evidence suggests a convenient overlap in intelligence. The coordinates of Pablo's associates, intercepted by sophisticated American planes flying high above the Andes, mysteriously found their way into the hands of Los Pepes' death squads on the ground. It was the age-old doctrine of war: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But in this case, their friend was a paramilitary group just as ruthless, if not more so, than the man they were hunting. The ethical lines blurred into non-existence. The CIA-Los Pepes connection remains a subject of intense debate and conspiracy. Did American tax dollars indirectly fund the rise of the next generation of drug lords? By focusing entirely on the Pablo Escobar death, the international community turned a blind eye to the methods used to achieve it. The Cali Cartel, who bankrolled Los Pepes, were essentially given a free pass to consolidate power, flooding American streets with even more cocaine while their rivals were being hunted down. For the American public watching the nightly news, this was presented as a triumph of justice. They saw their war on drugs yielding results. But for the agents on the ground, the feeling was hollow. They knew that by dismantling the Medellin Cartel using these methods, they were simply trading one monster for another. They were cutting off the head of a hydra, only to watch two more grow back instantly. Their victory was tactical, but but the strategic failure was looming. This period exposed the grim reality of the drug war: there are no clean hands. To kill the devil, their forces of good had to descend into hell and shake hands with demons. As the Search Bloc closed in on that final day in December, they weren't just carrying guns, they were carrying the weight of this silent compromise. The world wanted Pablo dead, and they didn't care how it happened, until the smoke cleared, and we were left to stare at the new monsters we had helped create. The end, when it finally came, was stripped of all glamour. There was no cinematic last stand, no blaze of glory. Just a fat, barefoot man scrambling across a clay-tiled rooftop in a middle-class suburb, clutching a pistol he never got the chance to use. On December 2, 1993, 3 gunshots rang out over Medellin. One to the leg. One to the back. And the fatal shot, delivered through the ear. The image that followed is burned into history: the members of the Search Bloc, smiling and posing over the bloody corpse of the world's most feared terrorist like big-game hunters on a safari. They had won. The Medellin Cartel war was officially over. But as the champagne corks popped in the presidential palace and at the DEA headquarters, a heavy silence fell over the slums of Medellin. Their Robin Hood was dead, but the monster of the drug trade was far from defeated. In the immediate aftermath, the question of who killed Pablo Escobar became a topic of endless debate. Was it the police sniper? Was it a member of Los Pepes? Or did Pablo, true to his promise, commit suicide rather than be taken alive? But ultimately, the bullet that killed him didn't matter. What mattered was what died with him, and what survived. The death of Pablo Escobar didn't stop the flow of cocaine to Miami and New York. In fact, shipments increased. With the Lion of Medellin gone, the hyenas of the Cali Cartel stepped in to feast on the carcass of his empire, becoming even richer and more sophisticated than Pablo ever was. The violence didn't end, it just mutated. The paramilitary groups like Los Pepes, having tasted blood and power, didn't simply disband. They evolved into the AUC, a right-wing terror organization that would plague Colombia for decades to come. This is the tragic irony of the story. We cheered for the death of the villain, forgetting that in the process, we had eroded the very laws we were trying to uphold. Their hunt for Escobar proved that the line between the lawman and the criminal is often drawn in the sand, easily washed away by the tide of war. Today, Pablo Escobar is a ghost, a face on t-shirts and a character in Netflix dramas. But his real legacy isn't on the screen. It's in the thousands of graves in Colombia. It's in the reminder that you cannot bomb a problem out of existence. When we look back at the rooftop in Los Olivos, we shouldn't just see the body of a drug lord. We should see a mirror reflecting the brutal cost of a war that has no real winners. What do you think? Was the destruction of Pablo Escobar worth the moral compromise of working with Los Pepes? Or did we simply trade one devil for another? If this story opened your eyes to the darker side of the drug war, hit that like button and share this video. History is written by the victors, but the truth is often buried with the dead. Let's keep digging. Subscribe for more stories they don't want you to hear.